we now welcome U.S. Trade Representative Ambassador Mike Froman and CSI President Peter Allgeier. The rapporteur for this session is Caitlin Convery, Legislative Assistant from Liberty Mutual.
Ambassador Froman, welcome, and thank you very much for appearing at the CSI Summit today. We know that you have an extraordinarily busy schedule every day, and so we appreciate very much you taking the time.
It's great to be here.
And I also want to thank you very much for all of the work.
I think they have a view on trade promotion at
I think so.
I wish they would stay and we could have a conversation about it. But,
Yeah, I wish.
I'm happy to have a conversation.
Well, actually, well, first of all, let me also thank you for the work that all of the people at USTR do. And I mean, they have been and continue to be fabulous in terms of their dedication to trade.
You train them all. So you,
No.
You take great credit.
But anyway, picking up actually where they left off.
Do you have a sign?
No, I don't have a sign. But you know, trade negotiations are difficult enough in themselves, just on the substance. But right now, I mean, the atmosphere is very, very difficult. Exhibit A, but not just in the United States, but also in Europe. And you've been traveling around here and also around the world. What are the principal misconceptions that you encounter, and how do you respond to those?
Well, first of all, Peter, thanks very much for having me. I always look forward to this event, and you've been a great leader with a great history at USTR and in the global trading system, and delighted to see you here, and I see a lot of colleagues from around the world as well. You know, it's been great to travel a bit out of Washington and around the country to talk about trade. And over the August recess, for example, while Congress was out of town, I went to Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, the state of Washington. And each place I go, whether I'm meeting with ag groups or small businesses, entrepreneurs, labor groups, environmental groups, to talk about our overall trade agenda. You know, the issues I hear most about, where I really think we need to continue our efforts to educate and update people's understanding of where we are. One is the issue of NAFTA. NAFTA is still obviously first and foremost in a lot of people's mind. And whether you think NAFTA was good for the country or not, the key message is what we're negotiating right now is not NAFTA. It goes far beyond in terms of raising labor standards and environmental standards, making sure that they're at the core of the agreement and fully enforceable. It deals with new issues like the digital economy or the role that state-owned enterprises play in the global economy, competing with our private firms. It strikes the right balance on intellectual property rights to make sure we're both promoting innovation, but also making sure that there is access to that innovation. And so we've taken a lot of lessons over the last 20 years, and our trade agenda reflects that. I think the second misconception is around transparency and participation. And this is an area, of course, of constant evolution, and there is always more that we could do on transparency. We're always looking for ways to do more. But if you just take TPP, we've had over 1,400 briefings on Capitol Hill on TPP. Individual members, groups of members, committees of jurisdiction, caucuses. We will meet with anybody, anytime, and go through the issues. And we've shown text to members who have requested to see text. Of course, every member of Congress can see the text. We've organized stakeholder events. In fact, at our negotiating rounds, whether it's TPP or TTIP, we stop the round for a period of half a day or so and invite anybody who wants to come, stakeholders to come and present their views, not just to us, not just to the US negotiators, but to all of the negotiators. We've got, of course, an extensive advisory committee system that was established by Congress that includes not only small businesses and local and state governments, but NGOs, every major labor union, health groups, consumer groups, and we want their input and their participation. We put out in the public our negotiating objectives for all of our negotiations, chapter by chapter. We've put out on our website responses to some of the most controversial issues, whether it's on the environment, or intellectual property, or investor-state dispute settlement. So we're always looking for ways to put out more information consistent with being able to actually negotiate an international agreement, which requires some degree of discretion. And then finally, I'd say the third major area where I think it's a very interesting conversation to be had with the American people across a wide range of perspectives. You know, there's a lot of concern in this country and I think around the world about globalization. And the concerns that are raised by globalization are legitimate in terms of the impact on jobs, on wages. But there's also a conflation of globalization and trade agreements. You know, globalization is happening. You know, it's a genie you can't put back in the bottle. It is just happening. And the question is whether we're going to be shaped by it or whether we're going to shape it. And the way we shape it is through trade agreements. By using our trade agreements to level the playing field for our workers, by raising labor and environmental standards, by taking on these new challenges like state-owned enterprises or the digital economy. This is the way we make sure that the global system is working for maximum advantage for us. And that, I think, is a very important distinction to get out there.
Great. Well, on your point about the openness to stakeholders, I think this week, when the TTIP negotiations are here, I think tomorrow you're taking that kind of a break for a whole day of the stakeholder input.
That's exactly right.
There was a very important summit held here in August with African leaders. And and trade and investment figured very prominently in that, of course. Be very interested in what your takeaway is from those meetings. What is it that African nations most need to plug into the international trading system, and what is the best way that the U.S. can support that?
Well, it was a really exciting few days here in Washington. It was the first ever U.S.-Africa summit of this sort. 50 foreign leaders here in town, and we had a lot of the trade ministers here, particularly around AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, about 40 countries that are part of that. And I think what was interesting is exactly what you said, is how central trade and investment was to the agenda. Mm-hmm. This wasn't just a discussion around foreign assistance, as important as foreign assistance is, particularly to catalyze the kind of changes that are necessary for these countries to develop. It was a conversation about how sustainable development ultimately requires economic growth driven by trade and investment, and what do all of us need to do to help promote that trade and investment. The history of AGOA is that over the last 14 years, exports from sub-Saharan Africa to the United States have tripled. Non-oil, non-mineral exports have gone up by about 4 times, and yet they are still very small, and there is much more to be done. And one of the lessons we took a year to review AGOA, talking to stakeholders, and businesses, and leaders and ministers from all around the world. One of the clear lessons that we drew from that review was that while the tariff preferences are important, they're not sufficient. Right. You have to deal with all of the supply side constraints that exist that will determine whether or not products coming out of Africa are competitive and can make it into global markets. So that's issues like infrastructure, trying to fix and fill a big infrastructure gap there. It's one reason why the Obama administration has put forward the Power Africa initiative, because we're taking one piece of infrastructure, which is access to electricity, and saying here's something we can make a major contribution to, our public sector as well as our private sector. But we also build roads through our MCC compacts and others. There's what I'd call soft infrastructure, which is having software systems between 2 customs organizations at the border so they can talk to each other. They can share documents, moving towards single border crossings so that a truck doesn't get to the border, have to wait 4 or 5 days, go through a border post, and then wait another 4 or 5 days to get to the other side. By the time those products get to market, they are no longer competitive. And those are the kinds of constraints that we have to deal with in addition to renewing AGOA and the tariff preferences. There's a huge amount of interest here by the American business community in Africa, and Penny Pritzker and the Commerce Department did a terrific job with Bloomberg Philanthropies in organizing a business conference that attracted some of the very best, most prominent businesses in our country, all interested in doing good risk-adjusted return, profit-oriented investing and trade in Africa. And to me, that was the most important and promising sign out of the few days, was how much private sector interest there was in helping to contribute to Africa's economic development.
Well, I think that our express delivery members will be very happy to hear what you said about dealing with that part of the infrastructure. Another region, of course, is Latin America, and we don't seem to hear so much about Latin America's role in U.S. trade policy these days. What do you see for the rest of the administration's term with respect to Latin America and our trade policy?
Well, look, I think we're trying to develop our trade and investment relations with Latin America through a number of different mechanisms. Some of the countries are part of the TPP. You know, you've got, of course, in Western Hemisphere, you've got Canada and Mexico, as well as Peru and Chile. There are other Latin American countries who have expressed interest in potentially joining over time TPP, and that's something we'll have to take up. I think there's a lot of excitement going on right now in the Pacific Alliance and what the Pacific Alliance countries are doing with each other in terms of integrating, not just from a trade perspective, but energy issues, mobility issues. I think it's one of the most exciting things going on. And of course, we're reaching out to our other countries, whether it's our CAFTA countries or other FTA partners, Panama, Colombia, to continue to develop our relationships there. I think the big question is, you know, Brazil is an incredibly important country in this region, and we'd like to find ways of further deepening our trade and investment relationship with them. There are some structural issues in terms of its being part of Mercosur, which I think affect the flexibility to deal with some of these issues. But it's something that we'd very much like to further develop and have a dialogue with Brazil about.
Right. You talked about globalization, and of course, that is the predominant theme or phenomenon, I should say, in the trading world. And so what we're seeing is much more of companies and businesses trading in tasks rather than goods, or with goods, I should say. Is this, and you have the global value chains that span both manufacturing and services, agriculture and services, is this changing the way you and your colleagues have to negotiate trade agreements now?
Well, it's certainly having a big impact because as you know, there's been some very good work done on global value chains and how, as you say, tasks are being done in various countries, products cross borders multiple times between their inception and when they actually reach the final consumer. And if every time they cross a border, they're picking up a tariff or they are stuck in customs, it's going to add to the cost, make them less competitive, and hurt the overall global economy. And so a lot of what we have to do is take a broader perspective towards trade liberalization. There's still tariffs to eliminate. We're doing that through TPP, through TTIP, we're doing it through ITA and EGA. But as you've noted, and as this crowd knows better than anybody, the relationship between services and these products is critically important. And when we think about how when you order something on Amazon, you're using computer services and telecommunication services and electronic payment services and express delivery services and distribution and retail, all to get one product. Right. We have to think about trade liberalization in that overall context. It's one reason, just to go back to the global value chains, that this issue around the trade facilitation agreement is so important. Because for the WTO, for the first time, reached a multilateral agreement really focused on taking unnecessary costs out of the global value chains. And it has a tremendous potential impact for both developed countries and, very importantly, for developing countries. And we are disappointed that India and a small handful of countries have blocked the implementation of the trade facilitation agreement, and we have to consider how to take that forward.
Well, let me just follow up on that. I mean, I think that many of us have been very disappointed at the position that India has taken. I think most of us would say that implementing trade facilitation actually benefits the country most who is putting that into place. And I wondered whether, first of all, you agree with that, and if so, then why not have those countries that are ready to do it go ahead unilaterally and let countries such as India and others who have hesitations wait on the sidelines?
Well, I think you're right that the countries that benefit the most are the ones who implement these changes and who have some of the less efficient and thicker borders right now. It's one reason why some of the estimates are that while developed countries stand to gain 10% reduction in trade costs, developing countries are more like 14 or 15% what they have to gain. And we've been working with, I know you had Roberto Acevedo here earlier, at least virtually. We've been working with Roberto, with the WTO, with other donors, with other multilateral development banks to figure out how to mobilize resources for trade capacity building so that countries can fulfill their obligations under trade facilitation, whether in Africa or elsewhere around the world. And we think there's a real potential. There's a lot of interest in helping there from the public sector as well as the private sector. You know, the significance of the trade facilitation agreement in December was that it was the first multilateral agreement that the WTO had come up with. And that's why I think not just the United States, but virtually all of our trading partners from developed to developing countries alike were so focused on getting this successfully implemented in July. And obviously there are other alternatives that can be explored, and I know some countries are talking about those alternatives. And we'll have to take a look at that. But you know, the first best form of trade liberalization is the multilateral system, and you know, we think that a failure for the trade facilitation agreement to be implemented as a multilateral system is going to have broad implications for the WTO itself.
Yeah.
You know, as Roberto has said, you know, if you can't do Bali, there's very little likelihood of having a post-Bali agenda, and so there's a lot at stake as to whether this gets done multilaterally or not.
Another area that is certainly very important for services firms is in the area of regulations, and you know, that can run from outright discrimination to a lack of transparency and due process, or the difficulty, the cost of complying with different regulations in different countries that are basically meant to achieve the same goal, and yet we see typically, not just in the United States, that regulators are very reluctant to get pulled into the trade negotiations. Now, with the TTIP, of course, that is one of the core objectives between the U.S. and the EU, is to deal with those issues. Can you talk a little bit about the difficulties that you're facing in that? And one particular question, is it really unreasonable to have financial services regulatory cooperation or coherence as part of the TTIP discussion, not to say what the outcome is?
Well, look, as you point out, this is a real opportunity. When you take two economies that are very industrialized, highly regulated, but may get to their regulated outcomes in slightly different ways, and see if there are ways of bridging those differences without lowering the level of safety, health, environmental protection. None of us have entered into this negotiation with the goal of deregulation or lowering the level of standards. We're both very proud of our respective standards in both the United States and in Europe, and our regulators are very proud of the work that they've done in their respective areas. I've been very impressed with our regulators to date who have fully engaged in this process, whether it's EPA or FDA or people at the Department of Transportation, you know, or others, to really see creatively how to help bridge these divergences. And I think we need to look at it really in two ways. One is we can look sector by sector where we think there's opportunity. And there we have a number of sectoral discussions going on in that regard. But we also need to look horizontally, because in our view, one of the reasons we get to these divergences in regulation is that we have very different perspectives on what the process is for making regulations. You know, in our view, if both sides were equally transparent about their regulations, published what it is they were going to regulate, published the draft regulation, invited the public to comment, anybody, whether it's Americans or Europeans, businesses, labor, NGOs, academics, individuals, and then have to take those comments into consideration in determining what the appropriate regulation is and basing that on evidence and science, I think we'd find ourselves with more convergence over time in our regulatory system. So a lot goes to our view that being open in how you regulate And having greater transparency, participation, and accountability will lead to more regulatory convergence over time. I mentioned that we're focusing on particular sectors, and we've brought certain sectors to the table precisely because they didn't have necessarily previous mechanisms for dealing with these issues. The financial services sector is an area which is quite different. There is, particularly since the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, there's been an explosion of financial regulatory cooperation. Some of it is bilateral between the US and the EU. We have a bilateral dialogue on financial regulation between the relevant authorities. And some of it is has larger participation, whether it's the G20 or the Financial Stability Board or the IOSCO or ISB or others. There are already a plethora of appropriate mechanisms for bringing financial regulators together to talk about that, which is the reason why we don't see the value added in bringing it into a trade agreement per se, unlike a number of other sectors where you didn't have such a plethora of mechanisms for talking about financial regulatory convergence.
I mean, your comment about how each side is very proud of its regulatory system, I do find it amusing that often what I hear from the critics on the European side is, well, we don't want our European standards to be lowered to US standards. And then what I hear on the American side is we don't want our American standards lowered to the European standards.
And I think we should stipulate that both sides actually have pretty high standards.
And that we're not
and that we may get there in somewhat different ways. And neither side is interested in reducing their overall standards of care.
One last question from me before we go to the audience on China. Here the Chinese have indicated an interest in joining the TISA. And of course, all of the TISA parties are looking at that and making their own decisions about do they feel comfortable that the Chinese will be able to negotiate or willing to negotiate at the level that TISA has been aspiring to. The US, but not only the US, Japan and to a certain extent Canada have demurred. And in the case of the US, you said, we are going to look at data points and basically sort of behavior of China. I guess I wonder, what are the data points that you think are most relevant? Are they behavior of China in international negotiations and other matters? Are they matters that are happening within China, the sorts of policies that they're implementing? What are the range of data points that you look at?
Well, look, I think you put it well, which is that everybody wants to make sure that any party that's going to join one of these negotiations, whether it's China or any other country, is prepared to meet the level of ambition and the high standards that these negotiations are intended to achieve. Nobody wants to simply expand the group at the expense of lowering the standards. That would be self-defeating. And so with regard to China, but this is true, I said, of every country, we need to look at the relevant data points. We have right now an ongoing negotiation with China on information technology products. It has been basically run aground for more than a year now because China has not been willing to live up to the same level of ambition as the other participants. We're working closely with them. We have made proposals. We have made creative suggestions as a way of trying to close the gap, but we're not there yet. And to me, if we're having trouble closing the gap around a relatively small number of tariff lines, when it comes to looking at making commitments about a vast array of services, that's an important data point. Secondly, we have some areas in services. We still have not seen China's implementation of the WTO decision on electronic payment services. Yeah. We've been talking to them for more than a year. They've lost the case. They've not yet implemented the rules necessary to bring themselves into compliance. And so again, it's a data point. Are they willing, even in one area of services, to bring themselves into compliance with their existing obligations? Right. And then thirdly, we're engaged with them in a very constructive effort right now around a bilateral investment treaty. And the teams are really working quite well together. And that too will be an important indication as we see the progress there on fundamental principles here and ultimately on the negative list as to how China views its commitment to liberalization in these areas. And as you say, that relates back to domestic issues around what kind of reform they're willing to engage in and how that's willing to proceed.
Great. Well, we have a few minutes for questions from the audience, and
can I just say, I see my colleague here, Andrew Robb, and I just wanted to recognize him. Andrew is, of course, the trade minister from Australia and has been a stalwart at the WTO-related issues, obviously in TPP, and really one of the most effective trade ministers in the world. So it's a pleasure to be in the same room.
well, we're very grateful that he's here too. So we have time for one or two questions. Someone raised, I can't see from here, so we'll leave it to the ushers. And could you please identify yourself and your affiliation?
That would be Inside U.S. Trade.
Yes.
You have your groupies that follow you everywhere.
Yeah, that's
don't
right.
they?
There are two sets of groupies. The one's earlier.
Wow,
and
these trade negotiations are getting so predictable. And,
At least he didn't bring a sign.
okay, well, thank you for taking the question, Ambassador Froman and Ambassador Allgeier. I wanted to ask about state-owned enterprises because I know that that's always been an issue that CSI has pushed on and that the U.S. is negotiating on in the TPP. So I was just wondering if you could give us an update about where those negotiations are. There have been reports that countries have sort of agreed on the rules and the definition of SOEs and are now negotiating on exceptions. And then further to that, it also seems like the U.S. has to balance its own sensitivities. We have SOEs, and we need to make sure that we're taking those into account. So how much do those sensitivities affect our ability to get ambitious outcome in terms of what the SOEs that the other countries are putting on the table? Thank you.
Well, I think this is one of the most exciting elements of TPP. Because it's one of the new elements. For the first time in a trade agreement, we'll be addressing the role of SOEs in the global economy and taking steps to ensure that when SOEs engage in commercial activity and are competing against our private firms and their own private firms, that they do so on a commercial basis. It's a pretty fundamental principle. And that they aren't able to take advantage of whatever subsidies they may have, or free land, or cheap energy, or any of the other benefits that may come from being state-owned, to put private firms at a competitive disadvantage. We have come a long way in the negotiations over the last year. Of course, nothing is done till everything is done, but we can see the shape of the chapter emerging on the rules, and the rules are good. They're high standard rules, high standard obligations, and the architecture of what we're pursuing with our TPP partners. And this is an area where it's an area of first impression. This is not something any of us have had in our previous trade agreements, and so we're all working on this together and trying to design this together. The architecture that we've come to is to have a high standard set of rules, and then to focus on where necessary. Countries need either specific transition periods or exceptions or carve-outs, and to have conversations about that. The state-owned enterprises play a different role in each of our economies. As your question notes, we all have them. We all have state-owned enterprises, and we all are sensitive to making sure that whatever obligations we agree to aren't going to get in the way of the proper operation of those state-owned enterprises. But we also have a wide range of perspectives around the table, and those are the issues that we're currently negotiating. I'm quite pleased with the progress. There are still a few remaining issues to go, and as we said, we're talking bilaterally with countries about their specific annexes, but we are making very, very good progress. And I think this will be one of the most important contributions of TPP to the global trading system and the rules-based system.
Thank you. I think we can handle one more question.
Hello, it's Shirley Ann George. I'm with the Canadian Services Coalition. The WTO, I think we could all agree over a beer, the structure is the preferred structure, but it's also a structure that doesn't appear to be working any longer. And I'm curious if you have some thoughts on whether we're nearing the time for a discussion of changing the requirement for consensus before we can move forward. Now we have a, if one is out, nobody wins type of environment.
Well, that's an awfully big question. Look, I think the WTO system is a critically important system. It's a pillar of the global economy. I think its dispute settlement mechanism has been absolutely critical for channeling the inevitable disputes between countries into a process where they could be dealt with professionally without resorting to trade wars. I think a lot of the aid for trade that is being done there is vitally important. I think the challenge that we face in the WTO is how to keep it as a vibrant organization in terms of trade liberalization and trade negotiation. And we all took hope out of Bali that this was a new chapter in the WTO's history, that we could take this package of agreements and build on this going forward. That's now been thrown into question by the actions of India and a couple other countries at the end of July. And we're still assessing, I think we're all still assessing the implications of that, both for trade facilitation and the specific issues that were agreed to in Bali, for the post-Bali agenda, and for the institution itself. And so that's, I think, likely to be part of an ongoing discussion that we have in Geneva and in capitals.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Froman, for the time that you spent with us today and for the clarity and the openness of the conversation. And let me just say, certainly on behalf of CSI members, and I think I can probably say it on behalf of the audience, that we all support very strongly the efforts that you're making and your team are making. And any time that we can be of assistance, please call on us.
Great.
So
Well, thank you.
very
Good luck with
much.
the rest of the conference.
Thanks.